So for the next couple of talks, this is always my favorite part for workshops. This is sort of a trademark. Oh, I'm getting a Lucy who can't stand up because her roller skates are too tight. So this is always my favorite part. I structure all the workshops I do this way, where I bring a couple of scientists and a practitioner together to talk about a project they've worked on together. So you can see the opportunity for science and management to work together in action. So we have two of those talks for you this afternoon. The first one is Lee Cerveni. She's going to be talking about mapping human values to guide landscape management decisions. She's with the PNW Research Station in Seattle. And she has brought her partner in crime with her, who is the Public Services Staff Officer on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie, who is Mike Schlafman. So help me welcome the two of them up here. Come on, guys.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. I'm Lee Cerveni.
And I'm Mike Schlafman. I'll just be standing over here for a while.
Okay, we got that squared away. So, so we're going to talk about a project today that we did together. I guess it was 2 years ago now, but it's still kind of ongoing, and we'll tell you more about that as we go along. But we're going to be looking at how we used landscape values mapping as a way to understand people's connection with the landscape for use in a strategy and planning decision-making process. First of all, I'm going to talk briefly about what we mean by human ecology mapping. Then we'll talk about how we did human ecology mapping for the Sustainable Roads Project in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And then we'll talk about how the mapping activity helped to build social capacity for engaging in dialogue and planning processes like these. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Okay, so you'll notice that there are some pictures of Mike and I on each slide, and your job is to find, where's Waldo? Now, we put pictures on the slides so that we could just remember who is giving what slide. But maybe it's entertaining for you all, I don't know. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about place. I don't want to get too heavy, deep, and real here right after lunch, but I just want to kind of set the tone a little bit for thinking, well, what do we mean by place? And then we'll provide a practical example about how we actually went out and mapped place in our study. There are three different ideas about place, and if you've been reading about this, it might be a little bit of repeat for you, but we're looking at place attachment, how people develop ties and connections to the landscape based on their repeated experiences in a place or their deep history or knowledge of that place. Then we have place dependence, and these are places that people rely on for their livelihoods, for their lifestyles. They return to these places to gather resources or to have experiences that are important to them. And then we have place identity, which is connections with place that help to define who you are. So it could be a spiritual connection, a cultural connection. It could be a connection through history or a special event that occurred. And these might be places you've actually never been to before, but there's an important connection there. And all of these factors kind of come into play when we do landscape values mapping. So I'll use the term human ecology mapping. What do we mean by human ecology mapping? Human ecology mapping involves the use of maps, other geospatial tools to gather information about values and uses that are important to the public. These could be special places. They could be social values as they appear across a landscape. They could be resources people use or things people do using resources. And they also could be ecosystem services or ecosystem benefits. And there's a lot of different ways we can do this kind of mapping. And participatory mapping is also a way to strengthen relationships, grow mutual understanding among people involved in the process. Do you want to add anything there? Okay. There are different kinds of mapping that we do, and we're going to talk about one kind today, but I just wanted you to be aware of other kinds in case you're interested in this. There are mapping activities where people can actually go on a blank sheet of paper and draw their own maps of the world and how they interact with the natural landscape. There are activities where you can go use pictures, cartoons, or write narratives right on the maps to tell stories about places. Other site scholars have used maps as a way to gather oral histories and life histories of people in a landscape. And one we're going to talk about a little bit today is using dots or stickers to identify critical areas or places. And there have been human ecology mapping where you can use dots or drawing lines or polygons all over a map to signify that this area on the map is important to you. There are other ways you can do this too, but I'm just giving a few examples so that you know that this is just one of many. I also wanted to mention that one of the benefits of human ecology mapping is that it's very flexible. It can be used in a variety of different ways. We've done it with public meetings. We've done it with workshops. We've done it online. We've done it in targeted user groups or stakeholder groups. We've done it in Spanish. We've done it in visitor centers on site where you go out to the forest. And we've done it at public events like farmers markets and fairs and other places where people go to. So it's very flexible in that way.
Is that me?
There's Mike.
I need the. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike. I wanted to start with this paraphrase of a quote. My background is in studying dead people's relationships to the environment and community planning. And this was one that was shared with me. And it gets to the heart, I think, for us in Mount Baker Snoqualmie of the role of human ecology mapping. And it's this idea that the map is not the territory. The values, the beliefs are within our hearts and minds. And I think what we've found through this process is that using the map as the focal point for the dialogue has helped show us the way. And we'll explain more about that as we go on. So the goal of our effort was built around sustainable roads, which some people know as minimum roads. It's part of subpart A of the travel management rule. And our goals were to engage the public in a variety of ways to understand the importance of roads to them, to gather information about places that matter in the roads they use, and to really produce some social spatial data that we could use in the planning and decision-making process in the future. Lee touched on this already. We had partners involved in multiple project phases, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. The key piece, though, is that we didn't just share the search for a solution or a vision of where we needed to go with roads. We shared the framing of the question we were asking at the initial stage. We shared the process for how we engaged the public, right down to decisions about how to facilitate public meetings. We shared the whole picture. We reached out to a variety of communities, rural and urban. It was well supported by U.S. Forest Service officials on the unit, although I will offer up, initially there was a lot of reluctance, and I'll go into that more later. We had multiple ways to engage, online blog, survey, and live workshops, 8 different live workshops with 284 participants, and a really good response on our online survey. So more about the role of partners. We viewed ourselves, the Forest Service and research, National Forest System and research, as partners in this and part of what we called our Sustainable Roads cadre. At our peak, we had 45 different nonprofit NGO groups, as well as communities, municipalities, all sitting at the table, developing the planning approach, the meeting schedule, identifying the locations, hosting the meetings, providing the snacks, which was a great idea, recruiting people to facilitate at the meetings and actually facilitating them themselves, and participating in ongoing communication. Some examples would be the survey was hosted by a non-Forest Service entity, which had nothing to do with circumventing our internal rules, nothing at all. But it did work very well. The website for the entire effort was hosted by, it was actually the Wilderness Society, and so on and so forth. The additional work supported by Portland State University was paid for by partners. We were integrated wherever we could be throughout the whole process. Anything to add? So what did we actually do? There were 2 main components. One was focused on human ecology mapping, and the second was kind of taking what we built around that map, the relationships, and moving into a dialogue. And so I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, my picture's on there, Mike. My turn.
You get why we have them now.
So we had 8 workshops, as Mike mentioned, all in communities throughout the Mount Baker Snoqualmie area, which, as you may know, is really large. It goes from the Canadian border all the way down to Mount Rainier, and we had a great participation. So for the mapping activity in these workshops, we had people gather around tables, 6 or 7 people gathered around a table, and we asked them to identify 8 destinations in the forest that are important to them for some reason. We asked them on a worksheet, why is that destination important to you? What kinds of activities do you do at that place? How often do you go there? And because this was a project related to roads, we wanted to know how they got there in terms of what vehicle. So once they filled all that information out on their worksheet, they turned to the maps and they put a dot on the map to correspond to each of these 8 places. And then we had a matching color highlighter that they used to actually map the roads that they used to get to that place. And so they repeated that 8 times to provide that information. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike in a second, but I did want to say that we have our amazing team from Portland State University here in the audience today, Rebecca and Diane. You want to raise your hands or say hello? That's not high enough. They digitized all this data. It took, I was going to say weeks, but months would be more accurate. It took a long time to try to figure out how to do this efficiently, and they did a great job and helped to create the maps we're going to see.
The second part of the process was the group dialogue. And to kind of take a step back, in one sense, we used the maps to gather a bunch of information. In another sense, we used the maps to begin to build relationships between people through sharing of stories, which then made it possible to have a different kind of dialogue. And so in the very same sessions we did the mapping, we went through a series of questions in the same small groups. One around consequences, people's perceptions of risk. What's at risk if we close roads, if we don't close roads? Followed by a dialogue around, if you were choosing, what criteria would you use to make a decision between trade-offs? How would you look at this landscape and situation? And then what strategies or opportunities could you put in place, or all of us collectively, to change the situation on the ground?
I know it's going to be hard to see these maps, so we won't spend a lot of time with them, but I did want to share what it looked like when we came up with all this, once we got all of this stuff digitized. So the map that you're looking at now reflects all 8 workshops combined. The blue blobs, as we affectionately call them, represent areas of intensity in terms of the places that people mapped that were highly important to them. So again, this is 284 people saying these places are important. The lighter blue color would be places that were mentioned but are less important. It's hard to see perhaps, I think, in this light, but we did the same thing with roads. So the darker, thicker red color roads are the roads that were most often mentioned in the mapping. Then there's an orange, and it goes down to yellow. So each road that was mapped was given a color. And so this way, everyone could see the intensity in terms of destinations and places, and then the intensity of roads. So this is for all 8 workshops combined for the whole forest. But I'm going to show you a couple examples at the district level just so you can see it blown up a little bit. There are 4 districts, but we'll just look at 2. This is the Mount Baker Ranger District, which is up north. And so you can see those blue blobs are blown up a little bit more, and you can see a little bit more on the roads. And this is the Snoqualmie Ranger District, which is the farthest to the south. That's an interesting one because you can really see it's kind of bifurcated. You've got things happening on the north end and down south. And if you know the area well, it's because of, well, the way it's set up. We have I-90 and, the mountain ranges there. And so there's really almost 2 different separate areas being mapped here. Did you want to add anything? Okay. So we also were able to use that to identify our top destinations, and that's indicated by the larger circles there. And again, I realize it's hard for you to see this, but just to see what we did. We also can look at this in a lot of different ways, and so we were kind of curious about how people living in different places mapped. And so we took zip codes. We had asked people to contribute their zip codes. So we have people who live in the Seattle area and where they went on the left, and then people who lived what we're calling the Mountain Loop area, which is really focused around Darrington, Washington, and where they went. And you'll notice on the left, the folks in Seattle tend to go everywhere. They go up north, they go down south, they go up and down. But the folks in Darrington tend to stay pretty close to home. And we saw that pattern repeated when we looked at other segments, but this is just an example. It's really interesting to be able to see, well, how do people relate to places differently? What are the differences in urban and rural? We also can look at by different activities. So on the left, you'll see these places were mapped by folks who are engaged in motorized recreation. And on the right was hiking. Hiking, by the way, was by far the most common activity that was indicated on the maps. And you can see how that's distributed. And we could do that by other activities too.
Back to the dialogue portion. One of the outputs was criteria for decision making. And surprisingly, I think in retrospect, across all 8 meetings, we had a lot of consistency. When confronted by the same challenges the agency confronts in terms of budget, biophysical constraints, other concerns, people tended to come up with the same kinds of rationales for making a decision. And so these are actually listed in order of preference as reported by participants. And we were able then to take this set of criteria and build those right into our strategic kind of planning process for looking at a long-term road maintenance strategy for the forest. And it fit really well. We also identified strategies and opportunities during the live meetings. And the 2 that stood out most often were, I'll start with the second bullet, a surprising willingness to pay more if there were an opportunity to maintain access, but then also followed by a deeply held desire to participate actively. It's surprising how many people have road maintenance equipment. It was a big surprise for most of us. And we've already, in the 2 intervening years, we've already seen different organizations form around this idea of maintaining access or maintaining a particular type of access experience. Most notably, People for Public Access is a kind of an emerging nonprofit. They do have heavy equipment. And we are actually just closing out on a maintenance agreement with them, where their intent is to maintain a handful of roads adjacent to their community that provide them critical access to areas they enjoy. And their intent is to manage it and maintain it to our standards, our agency standards. So pretty remarkable. And it goes from that level of detail all the way to folks who just want to get out and help us brush out a road or clean out culverts in the spring and want to know that if they see a problem, they can fix it. So it's been exciting. That's me again. So this map shows a combination of 2 things. One, it shows the highest density of responses and indications that a particular route is important to people. But if you think back to the criteria I just showed you, the top one was diversity of use, which was a surprise to us. That wasn't something we were looking at, diversity of opportunities on a specific road. And so we were able to pull from the public inputs both density, where do people want to go, but also diversity, and overlay those together into this map. And it enabled us in our internal process with our interdisciplinary team to utilize this map to validate the conclusions our interdisciplinary team was coming to with regard to the importance of specific facilities or opportunities, the sustainability of different access, depending on other resource conditions and so on and so forth, and really show people how their input connected with the outputs. Would you like to loop back?
We're going to loop back. So we spent a few months putting the maps together in the summer, or we collected the data in the summer. We spent the fall putting the maps together. We had a sharing in the winter with all of our partners in the Sustainable Roads Cadre, kind of a celebration and a thank you activity, which was really fun. And then the following summer, we looped back to the communities. And this was very interesting and exciting. We had a room like this, maybe a little smaller, with giant maps all over the walls. The maps I just showed you, although a few more of them. And we asked people to walk around and look at the maps and see if they could see themselves in the maps. Did these maps make sense? Did they confirm what you thought? Are there any surprises? And then, so after they spent some time looking at the maps, we sat down and went through a dialogue about the maps. What's missing? Is there anything that looks goofy? Just having a conversation about it. And I thought that was really, really valuable. And it was an important thing to do to show that we're using this information and we're coming back with it and we're actually doing something with it. Because I think sometimes when we have workshops and public information sessions. We gather all this wonderful information, and then we kind of go into the planning process, and people aren't really sure then what happened to it. And so we had several people come up to us and say, I'm really, really glad you came back, and we saw these maps, and they were thrilled. It was really exciting to be part of it. It also was an important timing aspect because we were able to keep the momentum going on the project, because sometimes when you disappear for a while, it's hard to come back and engage people. So we timed this so that people could continue to be involved in it and gather their information. So we asked people, do you see yourselves in these maps? And for the most part, they said, okay, he didn't really say that, but they did. We were really pleased that we got lots of nodding. Yes, yes, you got it right, is what we heard. So.
He's a really nice guy. He really is.
So how does this connect to future decisions? We're in the midst of completing access and travel management plans for a couple of different watersheds across the forest, where we're contemplating closing, decommissioning a significant number of roads, in some cases half the road mileage. The meetings we're holding for these site-specific or watershed-scale decisions are following the exact same format. We start with maps, we start with sharing stories about how we as individuals connect to the place, and then we move up to what are the challenges? How can we work on this together? And in practice, we've been able to take the maps, the public proposal, if you want to think of it that way, and use that as our starting point, our proposed action. What's been surprising in a number of ways is we're not finding that we're needing to move very far from that initial proposal, which probably should have been a lesson learned, that if you trust people, they're actually pretty smart, and get pretty close to what we come up with. The other thing that stands out is that participants in this second round, where the stakes are much higher, roads are going to be closed, have a much deeper understanding of the context of the social and ecological and biophysical, social, ecological, and economic constraints that we're working within. And there's a much higher level of acceptance, even amongst folks who didn't participate in the previous set of workshops. We're finding that as they go through this site-specific decision, something's changing for them. They're hearing from other folks, they're getting to engage in dialogue. We're very careful to tell folks that we don't think we have the right answer or the only answer. And they're more accepting of trade-offs so far. We'll see how that plays out. Other outcomes. And this was both intentional and somewhat surprising. The cadre of 45 partners refuses to go away. They want to help with everything because they are vested in the outcome, they're vested in the relationships. And they are helping to develop, facilitate, and lead other efforts beyond roads. And a couple examples. We're in the midst of an outfitting and guiding environmental assessment for Mount Baker itself for climbing, and we're looking at radical change. We're looking at I think it's like a 300 or 400-fold increase in the available use. And we've engaged the public through the same kind of process around maps, around getting really clear about where our values are and the stories we tell about the landscape. And they're directly developing monitoring strategy and a stewardship plan and engaging in the meetings and facilitating them. Other members of the cadre have gone on to do their own similar efforts. So it's really changed the landscape of people's expectations for how we engage. And so there's a number of sustainable tourism strategies being promoted by counties, by nonprofits, by others, and they're creating forums for us to come to collective visions at a county scale. And we can't empirically say this is a direct result. It's largely the same people, and they've made it clear time and time again that they value the opportunity to sit around a table with people and say, we don't have the answer. Let's find out what's important about this place on this map for all of us, and let's figure out a path forward. What did we learn?
Well, one thing we learned is that having our faces on the slides really helped us to figure out who was saying what.
Publishable results.
What we did learn, though, is really how important it was to gauge the partners early on. And we talked about this, but I can't say enough. Having the partners in the planning room where we were just trying to figure out what are we going to do, and then having them involved in pilot testing our protocol, providing a feedback on the instruments that we use, being guinea pigs throughout the process, and then facilitating the meetings, and now engaged in the ongoing dialogue. It's made all the difference. It's kept the momentum going. They've added tremendous capacity. It was impossible to do without them, and now, as Mike just told you, it's become something more. It's rolling on to something more. So they're really building social capacity. What we also learned is that maps do two things. Maps provide a way for people to take a moment to think about their relationship with a landscape, to see the landscape, see themselves on a landscape, and tell their own stories about that landscape. And we found that the maps also become a great vehicle to get people talking about their stories with a landscape side by side on the same map. And having that opportunity to tell stories, to share using the map, we don't have any quantitative proof on this, so not even a pie chart, but it seemed to diffuse conflict in the room, to be able to sit side by side on the map and tell your own story about the map with somebody else who might have quite a different story. How can you argue with that person or refute their story? They're telling you their story. So the map seemed to be a great way to talk about something that's really hard to talk about, values, in a way that was not very conflict-oriented. We had very little conflict in these public meetings, even though this issue is incredibly important to people in the room. And also, we learned that it was important as an agency, the Forest Service. We had, as Mike said, we had some people who were a little reticent to get out there and meet with the public. And I think, they came up to me after, and to Mike, we've had a lot of conversations about this. They learned that it's kind of okay to let go of control, and it's okay to say, we don't know all the answers, let's figure this out together. And so I think it was kind of transformational for many people in the agency involved in this to realize it could be a very productive experience working with the public on this. So what's next? We're working with the Deschutes and Ochiko National Forest right now to look at how we might do some mapping in anticipation someday of forest plan revisions happening. But there we're using a concept of benefits and mapping benefits, uses and activities, also looking at features at places, which is something we haven't done before. When you're thinking about your special place, are there some landscape features there that really stand out to you? What are some threats to those places and management strategies that you prefer to see in those places? So we'll be starting that this summer, we hope, in the Deschutes and Ochiko National Forest. So the next time, Cheryl, that you have us at this meeting, maybe we'll be able to share some results from that project. And I think that's it. Do we have time for questions?
Discuss. In the planning group, the cadre?
Planning group,
That's actually really interesting.
ideas that were passed on to the decision maker, or was that individual present? How did that work?
So the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, was how did we come to decisions within the cadre who helped develop the process that facilitated the public meetings and so on and so forth? Is that correct?
In the public meetings and the interactions that occurred, the ideas that were generated,
Ah.
how did they intersect with the decision maker?
In the meetings. The decision maker was in the meetings, but this initial step was to develop a strategy. So it was not an implementable decision. It was, a set of basically a vision and a set of goals and objectives, and a strategic path forward. So the decision maker was there. The decision maker intentionally, whether it was forest super district ranger, participated typically in one of the small group tables with everybody else, and very carefully put their personal values on the table as well, and actively participated. We tried as much as we could to not have that separation, to make it clear that our responsibilities to steward the land stay, our authorities stay, and we're also people, and we have values, and we need to put those on the table so you can see our biases. As far as the decision-making process, the output, yes, the Force Soup said this is the strategy based on public input and the work of our team.
And the public understood that going in.
The public understood that we were developing a strategy, and we repeated it probably too many times, that it was not a decision. This was the first step. This was getting on the same page, developing a common view and perspective, and then we're now moving into the site-specific decisions. Yep.
And to follow up on that question, and throughout the morning, we've heard we're managers of a lot of things. My question is around how do we manage expectations? Once we open the door to the public, they have all kinds of interpretations of what that means for them when we get to the decision. And clearly, not everybody wins everything they want to win. So I'm wondering how, in the process piece, do you manage those expectations so they're not equally double mad at us now because we let them down a tap in their mind and we didn't follow. So can you speak a little bit to how you're thinking about that?
Again, I think, I'm trying to think to how we kicked off the meetings. It was probably the first thing we put on the table was, and it was an easy way to drive the conversation. Here's the economic constraints. I mean, just plain and simple, we cannot afford the road system we have. Here's the biophysical constraints. We have roads in places where they're not going to stay on the hillside, where they have effects on resources that are unacceptable. And we laid that out right out of the gate, and I guess the way I'd put it is we told the truth. Eventually, many of these roads will go away. This process is about figuring out which ones we're going to keep. It's not about the ones that go away. Yeah. And the tone, yeah. Yeah, that's why we changed it from minimum roads to sustainable roads. Yeah. So we tried to focus all of it on which ones are most important to you, not which ones are you worried we're going to take away.
So some of these this issue obviously has a lot of people with very extreme ideals on each side. Did those people stay engaged, or did the process kind of self-limit those people from continuing to participate?
Those people stayed engaged. We were very diligent in recruiting folks to participate in the cadre to make sure, not only from the Forest Service, but asked our partners to help make sure that there was good diversity of representation, that as many interests as we could get at the table were there. There are strong relationships now between conservation community folks and motorized folks that have lasted because they're invested more in the process than the outcome. I'm not naive enough to think when we get to site-specific decisions there won't be conflict between those groups. However, they know each other. They have a relationship, and they believe they can work together.
Thank you guys very much.
Okay.